It started with a document no one was meant to find buried deep within the late Queen's private red box archives, sealed with intent and forgotten by time. But when Princess Anne opened that codicil, the silence inside Windsor shifted. Because what lay on that single page didn't just challenge protocol, it rewrote the future of the duchy itself. And at the center of it all was Prince William. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed was not chaos, not yet, but something far more dangerous: quiet realization. Reports suggest Anne had not intended to uncover anything extraordinary that day. The audit was routine, at least on the surface, part of a broader effort to organize and verify the late Queen Elizabeth II's final documents. But those familiar with the inner workings of royal archives whisper that nothing within the red box is ever truly routine. Each paper, each sealed envelope, carries weight, intent, and sometimes contingency. And it was within that layered silence that the codicil emerged, attached almost invisibly to a larger legal framework tied to the duchy. At first there was hesitation. Palace legal aides, seasoned and unshakable by most standards, reportedly paused longer than usual. The phrasing was precise, unmistakable. It spoke not of suggestion but of activation. Conditions, authority, transfer. Different interpretations of the document describe it as both a safeguard and a trigger, something designed to remain dormant until a very specific moment in time. And according to insiders, that moment may have already arrived. Anne, known in royal circles as the ultimate enforcer of duty over sentiment, did not panic. She did not alert the wider household. Instead, she moved with the kind of controlled urgency that has defined her decades of service. Those close to the situation suggest she understood immediately that this was not just a legal curiosity, it was a structural shift waiting to happen. The duchy, long regarded as a pillar of royal power and continuity, was suddenly no longer operating under assumptions that had held firm for generations. And yet, outwardly, nothing changed. No announcement, no disruption. Only a tightening of silence, the kind that signals something far more profound unfolding beneath the surface. Because within the sacred machinery of the monarchy, the most consequential decisions are rarely the loudest. They are the ones that move quietly, decisively, and without warning. But what made this discovery explosive wasn't just the document itself, it was the timing and who stood to lose everything because of it. For centuries, the duchy wasn't just land, it was power disguised as tradition, wealth cloaked in duty, and influence hidden behind ceremonial silence. But now, that same institution stood on the edge of a transformation no one had anticipated. Because the codicil didn't just reference the duchy, it redefined who truly controlled it. What had begun as a quiet discovery was now expanding into something far larger, something rooted deep within the very architecture of royal authority. Because to understand the weight of that single document, one had to understand the duchy itself not as a piece of land, but as a living system of power that had quietly sustained the monarchy for generations. Those familiar with royal financial structures often describe the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster as more than estates. They are engines, silent, constant, and fiercely protected. Reports suggest that for centuries, these entities have operated as the backbone of royal independence, providing not just wealth, but autonomy, freedom from political reliance, freedom from public scrutiny, and most importantly, freedom to act. And within that system, control has always followed a simple, unchallenged rule. The heir inherits, the system continues, and the balance remains, untouched. But the reality, as insiders whisper, has never been quite that simple. Because while tradition dictates automatic succession, the mechanisms behind that transfer are layered with legal nuance, historical precedent, and, occasionally, quiet intervention. The duchy is not just inherited, it is governed, managed, and, when necessary, protected from within. That is what gives it its true power. Not the land itself, but the control of it. And for decades, that control has symbolized more than financial stability. It has represented legitimacy, authority, the quiet confirmation of who stands at the center of the monarchy's future. Which is why any disruption to that structure is not just administrative, it is existential. It challenges assumptions that have stood for centuries. It forces questions no one wants to ask. And it exposes tensions that have long remained carefully buried beneath ceremony and protocol. In recent years, those tensions, though rarely acknowledged publicly, have reportedly grown harder to ignore. Various interpretations of internal dynamics suggest that control over royal assets has become more than a matter of tradition, it has become a matter of influence. Who directs the flow of resources? Who shapes the decisions behind closed doors? Who holds the quiet authority that never appears in official statements but determines outcomes nonetheless? These are the questions that have lingered, unspoken but understood, within the highest levels of institution. And now, with the emergence of this codicil, those questions are no longer theoretical. They are immediate. Because if the document holds the authority it appears to carry, then the long-standing assumption of automatic control may have already been quietly replaced by something far more deliberate, something designed, something planned, and that is where the true disruption lies. Because altering control of the duchy is not simply a shift in management, it is a shift in power itself. It redraws the internal map of influence. It changes who holds leverage, who commands loyalty, and who ultimately defines the direction of the monarchy moving forward. Those close to the situation suggest that even the possibility of such a shift has sent ripples through palace corridors, forcing a reassessment of positions that once seemed unshakable. Because in a system built on continuity, even the smallest change can carry enormous consequences. And this is not a small change. This is a redefinition of the very mechanism that sustains royal authority. A mechanism that, until now, had never truly been questioned. Which is why the codicil's existence is so unsettling. Not because it introduces something entirely new, but because it reveals something that may have been quietly put in place long ago. A contingency, a safeguard, a final layer of control embedded within the system itself. And as that realization begins to take hold, the focus inevitably shifts away from document and toward the people connected to it. Because if control is being redefined, then someone benefits. And someone does not. And as the implications began to settle, one question echoed through palace corridors who had tried to keep this hidden, and why now? I want you to write a detailed script based on the outline I provide for a royal monarchy using a bold, dramatic, and immersive storytelling approach. The script should be structured according to the provided subheading, ensuring that each section builds upon the previous one without abrupt endings or disconnections. The script must maintain a smooth, continuous narrative flow rather than feeling segmented, and follow the words count length mentioned with each outline, right in a paragraph format. Hook and transition lines will be the same as it. Tone and style. The script should have a bold, cinematic, and suspenseful tone to keep the audience engaged. The storytelling should be narrative-driven, focusing on mystery, foreshadowing, and emotional highs and lows. Avoid a dry, biographical format. The script should feel like an investigative and shocking exposé. No visual descriptions, scene instructions, or visual storytelling elements. This should be purely narrative. Use a mix of short and long sentences to control pacing and enhance drama. Engagement techniques that must be used. Cliffhangers and foreshadowing must be incorporated to build suspense. Ensure the script remains emotional and immersive, making the audience feel the struggles, triumphs, and betrayals. No standalone endings in any section. Each section should naturally flow into the next subheading without abrupt conclusions. Use bold and dramatic phrasing to emphasize key moments, struggles, and turning points. Highlight the contrast between success and suffering, making the story compelling. Section breakdown and storytelling approach. Each section must maintain a smooth transition, ensuring a continuous flow of storytelling. The narrative should be engaging, avoiding unnecessary factual overload. Avoid listing events mechanically. Each event must be woven into the broader arc of their journey. The script should not reset at each subheading but carry the momentum forward, ensuring previous and next subheadings remain connected. Language and accessibility. Use simple yet powerful language that is accessible to a broad audience. Maintain a storytelling approach, so the script should feel like a dramatic retelling rather than an encyclopedia. Entry. Avoid formal or academic tones, but the language should feel conversational and immersive. Ensure vivid descriptions through strong word choice rather than relying on visual cues or direct scene instructions. Insert subheading here. Word count equals 500 tone and style. Explosive, confrontational, dramatic hook. By the time the news reached the inner palace circle, it was already too late to contain. The codicil had been verified, authenticated, and quietly acknowledged at the highest levels. And with that, a shift began subtle at first, then unmistakable. Because power inside the monarchy doesn't announce itself. It moves silently, until it's undeniable. Key points. Legal verification by palace advisors. William being briefed privately. Immediate internal adjustments to authority structures. Tension among senior royals over sudden shift. Reports of urgent meetings behind closed doors. Silent acknowledgement that control had already begun. Transferring transition line. But, as William stepped forward into this unexpected authority, others were left grappling with what it meant for their own position inside the firm. Generate a detailed documentary-style script based on the provided outline and subheading. Maintain a bold, dramatic, and engaging storytelling approach with smooth transitions between sections. Avoid word repetition and ensure each section flows naturally into the next. Avoid adding outline headings. Just write the script and follow the word count length given, along with each outline above. By the time the news reached the inner palace circle, it was already too late to contain. The codicil had been verified, authenticated, and quietly acknowledged at the highest levels. And with that, a shift began subtle at first, then unmistakable. Because power inside the monarchy doesn't announce itself. It moves silently, until it's undeniable. What had once been confined to a single discovery was now unfolding across the inner mechanisms of the institution, and those closest to the process reportedly understood that the moment verification was complete, the conversation had already moved beyond if and into what now. Palace legal advisors, figures rarely shaken by complex documents, are said to have reached a rare consensus with unusual speed. Different interpretations of their response suggest that the codicil did not require debate, it required recognition. Its authority, its structure, and its timing aligned too precisely to be dismissed, delayed. And once that alignment was accepted, everything that followed became less about discussion and more about adjustment. It is now whispered in the highest echelons that Prince William was briefed in private, away from the wider network of palace operations, in a meeting described by some insiders as both restrained and profoundly significant. There were no declarations, no dramatic acknowledgments, only the quiet delivery of information that carried enormous weight. Because what he was being handed was not merely responsibility, but activation. A role that, according to reports, had been outlined long before this moment but never expected to arrive under such conditions. And those familiar with his position suggest that his response was measured, controlled, and deeply aware of the implications. Because stepping into authority is one thing. Stepping into authority that redefines existing structures is something else entirely. Almost immediately, subtle changes began to ripple through the internal framework of the monarchy. Not visible shifts, not public gestures, but quiet recalibrations that only those within the system could detect. Decisions that once followed one channel began to move through another. Consultations became more focused, more selective. And perhaps most tellingly, certain long-standing assumptions about who held influence, about how authority flowed, began to lose their certainty. Reports suggest that these adjustments were not announced because they did not need to be. Within a system as tightly structured as the royal institution, even the smallest procedural change carries meaning. And when those changes begin to align, they form a pattern that signals transition, even in the absence of formal acknowledgement. But with that pattern came tension. Quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. Senior figures within the palace, many of whom had operated under a different understanding of balance and authority, were suddenly faced with a reality that had shifted beneath them. Various interpretations of internal reactions describe a mixture of restraint and unease. Because while the codicil may have been legally sound, its consequences were deeply personal. Influence, once assumed to be stable, now appeared conditional. Positions, once considered secure, now require reevaluation. And within those private spaces where decisions are shaped, that reevaluation carried weight. Insiders whisper of urgent meetings held behind closed doors, gatherings where language was measured carefully and conclusions reached even more carefully. These were not confrontations in the traditional sense, but they were moments of recognition, acknowledgments that something fundamental had changed. Because once authority begins to move, even quietly, it cannot be ignored. And those who understand the system best are often the first to sense when its balance has shifted. The conversations, according to those familiar with them, were less about resisting the change and more about understanding its scope. How far did it extend? What did it alter? And perhaps most importantly, what could no longer be controlled? Because beneath the surface, one truth was becoming increasingly clear. The transfer of control was not approaching, it had already begun. Not with ceremony, not with declaration, but with action. Quiet, deliberate action that aligned perfectly with the framework outlined in the Codicil. And that realization carried a weight, could not be easily dismissed. Because in a system built on continuity, the moment continuity is redefined is the moment everything must adjust. And as those adjustments continued to unfold, the focus inevitably shifted toward the individuals most affected by them. Because while one figure stepped into a newly clarified authority, others were left to confront what that authority meant for them. But as William stepped forward into this unexpected authority, others were left grappling with what it meant for their own position inside the firm. Inside the palace, reactions weren't public, but they were powerful. Shock, resistance, quiet frustration. Because while the codicil may have been legal, its consequences were deeply personal. This wasn't just about land or titles anymore. It was about control, and who no longer had it. What had begun as a contained legal revelation was now unfolding as something far more human, far more fragile. Because behind the structure of the monarchy, behind protocols, the titles, the carefully maintained image, there exists a network of relationships, expectations, and unspoken hierarchies. And when those hierarchies shift, even silently, the emotional impact can be impossible to contain. Reports suggest that senior figures within the institution did not react with outward defiance, but with something more complex: a tightening of tone, a measured restraint. Conversations that, while controlled, carried an unmistakable tension beneath their surface. Because in a system where stability is everything, sudden change, even justified change, can feel like disruption. Those familiar with internal palace dynamics whisper that discussions became more frequent, but also more cautious. Words were chosen carefully, implications weighed heavily. Because this was not a disagreement that could be resolved through simple consensus. It was a shift rooted in authority itself. Various interpretations of these private exchanges describe moments of quiet disagreement, not explosive confrontation, but a slow, deliberate clash of perspectives. Some questioned the precedent, others questioned the timing, and some, it is suggested, questioned whether such a mechanism should ever have been allowed to exist in the first place. Because if one layer of authority could be quietly redefined, what did that mean for the rest? At the center of this tension stood Prince William. Not as a distant figure observing the shift, but as the one expected to carry it forward. And with that expectation came a weight that few could fully understand. Because stepping into authority is not just about power, it is about responsibility. Responsibility to maintain balance. Responsibility to uphold tradition. And now, responsibility to navigate a system that had just revealed a hidden dimension of itself. Insiders suggest that his response remained composed, but that the reality of the situation settled in gradually. Not all at once, but in layers. Each realization, bringing with it a deeper understanding of what had changed and what could never return to what it once was. Because once authority is redefined, it cannot simply be reversed without consequence. Standing just as firmly within this unfolding moment was Princess Anne, unwavering, controlled, resolute. Those who have long observed her role within the monarchy often describe her as the embodiment of duty. Someone who does not bend under pressure, but instead reinforces the structure around her. In this moment, that characterization appeared more accurate than ever. Reports suggest that she did not engage in prolonged debate or hesitation. The Codicil, once verified, was not a subject of interpretation, it was a directive to be followed. And in maintaining that stance, she became both the enforcer and the stabilizer of a system under strain. Because while others processed the emotional weight of the shift, Anne remained anchored in its execution. But even with that steadiness, institution itself could not avoid recalibration. The monarchy, built on continuity, now found itself adapting in real time. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Adjustments were made, roles were reconsidered. Influence, once assumed to be fixed, became something more fluid. And within that fluidity, uncertainty inevitably emerged. Because when a system reveals that it contains layers not previously acknowledged, trust in its predictability begins to shift. And that shift, even when managed carefully, carries consequences. Yet beneath the tension, beneath the quiet disagreements and the measured responses, another realization was beginning to take hold. This had not been a reaction to recent events. It had not been written in haste or triggered by immediate concerns. It had been placed deliberately, long before any of this unfolded. A safeguard, a plan, something designed to exist quietly until the moment it was needed. And now that moment had arrived, bringing with it not just change, but revelation. Because the Codicil did not create a new reality, it exposed one that had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, all along. And just as the dust began to settle, a deeper truth emerged. This had never been a sudden decision. It had been planned all along. Long before the whispers, before the discovery, before the tension now gripping the palace, there was a plan. Quietly written, carefully placed, waiting for the exact moment it would be needed. And now, through that Codicil, Queen Elizabeth II had spoken one final time, with a clarity no one could challenge. What now appears as a sudden shift was, according to those familiar with the late Queen's approach to duty, anything but sudden. Because if there was one constant that defined her reign, it was foresight, the ability to anticipate not just immediate challenges, but future fractures that might threaten the stability of the institution she spent a lifetime protecting. Reports suggest that her understanding of the monarchy was never limited to the present moment. It extended far beyond it into scenarios that others may have dismissed as unlikely, but which she quietly prepared for nonetheless. And within that preparation lay a principle she upheld without compromise. The monarchy must endure, regardless of personal dynamics, regardless of internal tension, regardless of shifting influence. Those who have studied her legacy often point to her use of documents, not just as records, but as instruments of continuity. Letters, directives, legal frameworks, all carefully structured to ensure that when the time came, the institution would not falter. The Codicil, as it now emerges into focus, appears to be one of those instruments. Not an isolated addition, but part of a broader system designed to protect the crown from instability. Various interpretations suggest that it functioned as a safeguard, a mechanism that would only activate under conditions that threatened the balance she worked so carefully to maintain. And in that sense, it was not just about control of the duchy. It was about preserving a structure that could not afford to weaken. Because within the monarchy, stability is not optional, it is essential. What makes this revelation particularly powerful is the intent behind it. Because the Codicil does not reflect uncertainty. It reflects decision. A deliberate choice to prioritize duty over personal influence, to ensure that authority would remain aligned with responsibility, even if that meant overriding assumptions that had taken root over time. Insiders whisper that this was the Queen's way of maintaining control without direct intervention, a final measure that would only reveal itself when absolutely necessary. And now that it has, the message is unmistakable. The future of the monarchy was never meant to be left to chance. It was meant to be guided, protected, and, when required, corrected. At the center of this execution stands Princess Anne, the one entrusted to act without hesitation. Those familiar with her role describe her as the embodiment of the Queen's principles, steady, disciplined, and unwavering in the face of pressure. And in carrying out the implications of the Codicil, she has not simply followed instruction. She has fulfilled a responsibility that extends beyond the present moment, anchoring the institution in the very values it was built upon. Because enforcement, in this context, is not about authority, it is about preservation. And in preserving the structure, she ensures that the Queen's vision continues to shape the monarchy, even in her absence. And then there is Prince William, positioned not by circumstance but by design. Because if the codicil represents foresight, then his role within it represents intention. Reports suggest that this was never about elevating one figure over another for the sake of preference. It was about aligning the future of the monarchy with someone prepared to carry its weight, someone expected to embody its continuity. And in that positioning, a quiet but undeniable truth emerges. This moment was anticipated, planned, built into the framework long before it became visible. Because in the end, what this codicil reveals is not just a shift in power, but a philosophy. A belief that the crown must always come before the individual. That legacy must be protected, even at the cost of comfort. And that when the time comes, the system must be able to correct itself, without hesitation. And now that correction has begun, leaving behind not just change, but clarity. Because even with the Queen's intentions now clear, the question remained what happens next in a monarchy that has just been quietly reshaped. No announcement, no grand declaration, no ceremony, and yet everything had changed. Because the most powerful shifts in royal history are never loud, they unfold in silence, behind doors the public never sees. And this was one of those moments. What had begun as a discovery, then escalated into verification, and finally settled into internal tension, now reached its most subtle phase, the transformation itself. Not visible, not declared, but undeniably real, because within the structure of the monarchy, change does not require spectacle to be effective. It requires alignment. And according to those familiar with the inner workings of the institution, that alignment had already begun to take shape around Prince William. Not in a way that disrupted the outward rhythm of royal life, but in a way that quietly redirected its internal flow. Decisions that once moved through established channels began to take on a different tone. Consultations, once broad and layered, became more focused, more deliberate. And within that subtle narrowing of process, a new center of gravity began to emerge. Reports suggest that this transition did not need formal acknowledgement, because those operating within the system understood it instinctively. Authority in this context is rarely announced, it is recognized. And once recognized, it begins to shape behavior without instruction. Palace insiders whisper that interactions shifted in small but meaningful ways. Deference adjusted. Input recalibrated. The dynamics of influence, long governed by tradition and familiarity, began to reorganize themselves around the reality that had now taken hold. Because when a structure reveals a new point of control, the system adapts to it, often without resistance but never without consequence. At the same time, the institution itself maintained its outward composure. Public appearances continued. Engagements proceeded. The steady rhythm of royal duty remained unchanged to the outside world. But beneath that continuity, something fundamental had shifted. Because while the monarchy is built on visibility, its true strength lies in what remains unseen. And in this case, what remained unseen was the quiet reinforcement of hierarchy under a newly clarified structure. A structure that, while rooted in tradition, had now been subtly redefined by the very mechanism designed to protect it. Those observing from the outside began to sense it, even if they could not fully articulate it. Media analysts, seasoned in reading the smallest signals, reportedly noted a change in tone. Not dramatic, not overt, but present. A difference in how decisions appeared to be made. A shift in how influence seemed to flow. Nothing that could be confirmed, nothing that could be directly attributed, but enough to raise questions. Because when an institution as consistent as the monarchy begins to feel different, even slightly, it suggests that something deeper has changed. Something that cannot be seen, but can be felt. And within that feeling lies the true significance of this moment. Because what has occurred is not simply a transition of responsibility, it is a redefinition of how authority is understood within the system. A movement away from assumption and toward design. A reinforcement of structure through foresight rather than reaction. And at the center of that movement stands a figure who now carries not just the expectations of the future, but the weight of a decision made long before this moment arrived. A decision that has quietly reshaped the path ahead. Yet for all its significance, the transformation remains contained. There are no public confirmations, no official acknowledgements, no visible markers of change. Only the steady continuation of royal life, now operating under a framework that few fully understand. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. Because in the absence of noise, the shift becomes even more profound. It settles into place without resistance, without disruption, becoming part of the system itself. And as it does, it leaves behind a reality that cannot be undone. A reality that defines what comes next, even if it is never openly discussed. And as the world continues unaware of what truly unfolded, one final reality stands undeniable. In the end, it wasn't just a document. It wasn't just a clause. It was a message clear, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. A final act of control from a queen who understood that the future of the crown could never be left to chance. What began as a quiet discovery had now revealed itself as something far greater, a defining moment that would echo far beyond the walls where it was first uncovered. Because within the structure of the monarchy, legacy is not built through sudden gestures or dramatic declarations. It is constructed carefully, piece by piece, through decisions that often remain hidden until the moment they are needed most. And this codicil, now fully understood in its weight and intent, stands as one of those decisions. Not reactive, not accidental, but precise. Intentional, designed to endure. Those familiar with the inner workings of royal continuity suggest that moments like this are rare, not because the mechanisms do not exist, but because they are rarely required to reveal themselves. The codicil did not create a new order, it exposed the foundation that had been quietly laid beneath the existing one. A foundation built on a single principle: that the institution must always come before the individual. And in reinforcing that principle, it re-established a boundary that cannot easily be crossed. Personal ambition, no matter how carefully positioned, must always yield to the greater structure. Because the monarchy, at its core, is not a collection of individuals, it is a system. And that system, as this moment has shown, is capable of correcting itself when necessary. At the center of that correction stands Prince William, not simply as a beneficiary of circumstance, but as the figure around whom the future has now been quietly anchored. What makes his position so significant is not just the authority he now holds, but the manner in which it has been established. Not through public transition, not through ceremonial acknowledgement, but through a mechanism that bypassed expectation entirely. Reports suggest that this has solidified his role in ways few could have anticipated, placing him at the heart of a structure that has just been subtly, but decisively, reinforced. And with that reinforcement comes a responsibility that extends far beyond the present moment. Because when authority is granted in this way, it carries with it the weight of intention, the understanding that it was not given lightly and that it must be upheld with equal precision. Equally central to this moment is Princess Anne, whose role has moved beyond discovery into execution. Those who have long observed her place within the monarchy often describe her as the steady force that ensures continuity when uncertainty arises. And in this case, that role has been fulfilled with unmistakable clarity. She did not hesitate. She did not allow the implications to be diluted by debate or delay. Instead, she acted in alignment with the very principle the codicil represents: duty above all else. And in doing so, she has reinforced not just the authority of the document, but the stability of the system itself. Because in moments of potential disruption, it is not just the mechanism that matters, but the person willing to enforce it. As a result, what could have become a period of instability has instead transformed into one of quiet recalibration. The monarchy, though tested, has not fractured, has adjusted. It has absorbed the shift and integrated it into its ongoing rhythm. Outwardly, little appears different. The continuity remains intact. But beneath that surface lies a structure that has been subtly strengthened, its lines of authority clarified, its future direction quietly secured. And that is perhaps the most powerful outcome of all. Because true stability is not the absence of change, it is the ability to endure it without losing form. And so, what remains is not just memory of a document discovered, but the lasting impact of what it represents. A reminder that within the House of Windsor, power is never as simple as it appears. It is layered, protected, and when necessary, revealed with precision. Because in the House of Windsor, power isn't always inherited. Sometimes it's revealed when the time is finally right. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.